Joining me today for the first proper episode of the Cunning as Folk podcast is Sandor Katz. Sandy, as I call him, is a fermentation revivalist and an amazing person, in my opinion. Really has done so much to bring to the fore this important art that really I think grew out of his interests of cooking, nutrition, and gardening. And like for so many of us, it started with sauerkraut and we never stopped. But in this episode, what I wanted to get down and to the point with him about was a most recent book of his, a book called Fermentation as Metaphor. Really getting to the root of what I think is so important for this time as we move into the triplicity of air. I think, and especially as so many of us are literally stuck in small spaces with other people, how do we move into this moment in a way that's really about fermenting and finding that effervescent quality that is so present here? And I could think of no one else to do this with but Sandy, because of this really lovely book that he's published recently. But he's a wealth of knowledge and information, and has really, devoted so much of his time to the exploration of fermentation on all levels, and also is just a profound mover within the food culture, in my opinion. And he's my honored guest today, so I hope you enjoy. Tune in now.
Sandy, thank you for joining me today and chatting with me a little bit. As I said, when I first met you, how many years ago was it? It was like 12?
I mean, I don't know. You were probably like 19 or 20 years old. So
yeah. Oh my gosh, that's right.
I think it's more than 12 years, but I don't know.
That was like 17 years ago, 18 years ago. Okay, so it has been a long time. And when we first met, I had no idea that, later in not knowing who you were, you were already well known amongst many of my friends that would label themselves part of the punk community, because of wild fermentation. So you'd already published wild fermentation at that point. Is that right?
Yeah, that was 2003.
Yes.
The wild fermentation was published.
Exactly. And I think you hadn't yet had The Revolution Will Not Be Microwaved published, but it was about to be.
Yeah, so this is the new version of wild fermentation that came out in 2016, but the original version came out in 2003 with the green cover.
Yeah.
Then my next book was this, but I probably was working on this when you first came and visited. So this was published in 2006. So maybe it was like somehow that winter of 2005 or something that you showed up. Exactly. And then in 2012, I published this one, The Art of Fermentation.
Which is an amazing book.
And then just at the beginning of last year, or really, no, it was in the middle of it. It was like September of last year. Fermentation as Metaphor came out, and then I just 2 days ago submitted my new book, Fermentation Journeys, which will be out probably in the fall.
Yes, and so you've sat, I think, and that's the thing that is so amazing to me is, and I think also when you were doing the work with The Revolution Will Not Be Microwaved, my current work that brought us together was I was doing an anthropological study on the queer sanctuary that you were currently living in at that time. And it was interesting, the alignment there, because you were thinking about counterculture food movements, and I was looking at also counterculture movements within the United States. And so I think we kind of hit it off immediately then, but I had no idea that you were already really cool. Like, I mean, it was obvious to me that you were cool, but I didn't realize that other people would have thought that. So then I always think of it as like I befriended this sort of foodie rock star without realizing that I was befriending them. But to bring it back to where I wanted to kind of take the conversation to begin with is before we really go full throttle into fermentation, is that, you know, I would, as we were sort of all going into our experiences that ended up being 2020 for all of us. Sanctuary was a word that I heard coming up more and more. And I think that it's an important word for us to understand and sit with at this time, because I know in my context, I think in many others' contexts, there's been an aspect of isolation and distancing, especially physically distancing from one another, that has caused us to really sit with what is it, where are we in place, you know, like where is this place that we're in. And I think that we're really asked in many ways to embrace that opportunity, however you want to think of it, as a moment to create sanctuary for ourselves in our embeddedness in place. And I think you, as well as many others who lived and sustained sanctuary for other people for a long time, particularly in this context, because it was for, in my opinion, it was for what, from a dominant social cultural perspective in the United States and the history of it, was linked to people that were versions of outcasts. You know, they didn't fit within the social world that they were maybe fit the way that they were meant to or idealized. They didn't fit. And so they took it upon themselves to create a place that was for them within that context and for people like them. And I guess it's a broad question, but I just wanted to know for you, what does that word sanctuary mean? Because you've lived it in a way that's more intimate than a lot of us have. And do you think that there's a way to sit with that experience that's important for all of us now that are kind of cut off from one another physically and need to sanctuarize our spaces and places that we live in?
Well, sure. Well, I mean, first of all, I think that, I mean, a lot of the changes of 2020 and now into 2021, I mean, they are just, responses to the reality of the moment. So, if for many years, sanctuary meant this, a place with a, total open door policy where, random people just turned up all the time, for the people who, I mean, I moved out of that space 10 years ago, but for the people who, sort of have continued, sort of living that as their day-to-day reality, that just, that just became not tenable in the context of COVID, already living with a, kind of a larger than average, pod of people, and managing the risk just of, the interactions each of those people is having day to day, just having a total open door policy to whoever would turn up there, I just think, has not been tenable. But, that doesn't mean that the idea of sanctuary is, is no longer tenable. I mean, I think if anything, sanctuary is more, more necessary than ever, because so many people just, are feeling such intense isolation, so many relationships with problematic dynamics, have been intensified by the pressures of the pandemic and physical isolation and all of that. So I mean, if anything, the need for sanctuary is, is only intensifying. And so for me, sanctuary, like I mostly guess I would have defined it as a as a physical space, but intended to, provide a shelter, space, support for people who need it. But I think that beyond the idea of like a specific space, providing space for people, sanctuary also is a state of mind, and it's like our willingness to hold space, emotional space, for people who need someone to listen to them, need someone to see them and hear them. So it's not only about providing physical space. I think it's also about holding space in your heart for other people and their needs. And
well, I think too, tell me if this is wrong. I think I do think there's a big state change, and I think where it kind of folds into some of the fermentation as metaphor pieces that I want to make sure we talk about. The idea of an open system, or it's more open and free flowing, people can come from anywhere around. Though what I always noticed from my participation and observation of that experience was that those things were also being provided for the people that lived there. It wasn't just for the imagined other that would show up. Though I do think that the signs and indications, like the gargoyle on the threshold, was definitely there to kind of let you know that if you were odd, you were welcomed to this place, and but at the same time, I think people that lived there, they were also, there was something about that concept that also resonated for them. It wasn't just what was provided for others.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think everyone who lives there is seeking sanctuary in some way.
Exactly.
But then if you want to be there for a while, you also have to give yourself over to the project of providing sanctuary.
Providing sanctuary. Yeah. And I think that what we have now, because I think whereas what I realized was that the sanctuary that we're referring to is one that provided it for many others, and I know hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that have felt that sense of sanctuary there. Now it's almost like the responsibility of that is not in single places. It's like within our own home or our own place that we live. We're now needing to figure out how to make sanctuary for ourselves and for those that we incidentally have ended up being kind of isolated with, or maybe even planned isolation with them, and so it was more, I think the piece that you said about emotional availability was really important, because being able to actually have those meaningful encounters with whoever whoever the others are that you're sharing place with now at this moment is probably a very profound piece of how we begin to create sanctuaries, actually listening to one another, and hearing what other people's insights and voices are at this time. But yeah, that was more what I was thinking about. I was like, that you and other people who did it for so long are kind of like the experts for yourself of why you went there. Why was sanctuary appealing to you in the first place? What does it give you the opportunity to do that it doesn't other places? And why would you provide it for yourself and others? So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, I think that, we all need sanctuary, right? I mean, we all have, we all have our needs, and, sometimes it feels like they're being met better than other times, but, we all need the embrace of other people. And I think that, this time has been really constricting for people, in terms of like, in terms of movement and seeing people. And so, right now for many people, like, the people who they might feel most seen or heard by, are not accessible to them in the direct physical realm. And so, I mean, I guess this sort of like forced constriction of our worlds, maybe forces us, if you can't be with the ones you love, then love the ones you're with. It just sort of forces you into this practice of, embracing the people you are around, and trying to open yourself up to them, even if they're not the people who you wish that you were with all this time. They're the ones you are with. And I think that that just holds profound lessons and implications for all of us. I mean, the particulars are maybe specific to this year, but the idea that like we need to make space for people better, and that we all need more space made for ourselves, or maybe we don't all need that equally, but many of us, many people need that. And just trying to make space, trying to hold people, trying to listen and see, and make people feel heard and seen and held.
Yes, and I think that is it's not where I immediately went when I was thinking about it, but I think you're right. I think that's the fundamental piece that is there. And I think that what it creates opportunity for, which is where it folds so naturally, and for me around fermentation, is that say you're especially the process that you sort of inspired through some of the writings that you did with wild fermentation, which was around if you're wanting to, like, this idea that in our environment all the time are yeast and bacteria that they're constantly wanting to find sources of their nutrition for themselves all the time. And that by having, that open vessel, that you're going to allow them to take residency in, which we're talking about that idea of prior, there was maybe sanctuary involved more this openness that allowed people to come in to it. Reminds me a lot of that, like the mead fermentation, where you picked your flowers and you tossed it into the sweetened water, and you're letting whatever is on the flowers or the berries or whatever you're using, as well as in the environment, to sort of find home within that container, that you're leaving open. And I think that there is an aspect of that is still very possible now. It's just less that, as you said, it may not be the ones that you feel like you would normally relate to or be able to be heard by or hear what they have to say. But now is a moment where we have to really stretch our ability to be open for whatever is around, whatever, again, like whatever bacteria and yeast is sort of latent in the air.
But, I mean, I would say that was really like, the whole time that I was living in community, which was, 1993 to 2010. I was living in the sanctuary space, but my whole experience of living in community was sort of that, like, sure. I mean, a group of my best friends from college and I, we always had a fantasy of having a community together, but that never happened. But I found myself in a community with these other people that, so sometimes some of them felt like my best friends and sometimes some of them felt like my worst enemies, but it's like they were the people I was with. And and really like the learning process of living in that way was just trying to work it out with the people I was with, rather than the imagined ideal people that, that it would have been easy to do this with, in my mind.
And that was a lot of what I focused on as well in the work I did, was the many voices and the idea of what that sanctuary space, who is it for, and how is that negotiated through interactions that people have with each other. So I think that's a really good point. And I guess where I go with it now is like because I read fermentation as metaphor. What was so important to me about seeing that you had written this book was that from the some of the things I pay attention to as an astrologer and trying to think about big changes, for a lot of people that pay attention to that form of timekeeping, is that there was a huge change where we're going from this triplicity, this big period of time that has for like 240 years been dominated by earth concerns, the concerns of ownership and who has possession over resources and land, literally, to a huge change that occurred at the end of 2020, which was moving into this era that's dominated by air. And I always think about in fermentation, the carbon dioxide that's created that bubbliness that we really love so much about things that have fermentation going on with them. And even the indications of this hidden process that's happening is this effervescent quality that's happening there. I've been thinking about it a lot. To me, it had already, even before I was aware of this amazing book that you're writing, that fermentation was like the mother metaphor for me of how we try to move into this now 240 years of air, being the important thing, because I think that, and we've witnessed it around us, a lot of the fabric of our social cultural world that we live in has been threatened, and like for good or bad, there's been a lot of decay. And in my own life, we had more people die in my family in 2020 than has ever happened. I think that there was the element of things going to an end and decaying was really powerful, has been a powerful thing that a lot of us have experienced in the last year. And in thinking about process where things, there's the composting that goes on, which I think is like embracing, as opposed to what happens if it's all kept in one thing and it goes off. It's like putrefying. And I feel like a lot of people's lives, while they're in this containment, they feel that their life is putrefying, And I think that what we need to lean into more is the mysteries of composting, which I think is super powerful, and about our emotional, physical, everything. But then also another one, which is fermentation, which is, if we go back to the idea of the mead bowl, the things coming in, we're just working with whatever's there. Then though, it goes to a change, doesn't it? It doesn't stay like this in this open state.
Never.
Exactly.
No.
So that's, I think, where we're experiencing it now, is there's like a form of containment that is kind of necessary in the process of fermentation. Am I wrong there, or?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, I mean, at least in the literal practice of fermentation, sure. I mean, when a person is fermenting, there's always a vessel. There's always something containing it. A crock, a jar, a bowl, something. Now, fermentation also is a spontaneous natural phenomenon. So, if you harvest berries, you will inevitably find that, some proportion of them have already begun fermenting before you harvest them. So, in the natural world, fermentation really does not need a vessel. A damaged berry on a vine can
exactly
ferment.
Doing it already.
But yeah, I mean, I would say this is one of the things that characterizes the, sort of intentional human application of fermentation is the idea of having like a container of some sort. And then beyond that, I would say that because all of the plants and animal products that make up our food are populated by such elaborate communities of organisms, the question of which organisms are going to thrive is always the really important one. And in most fermentation practices, that's determined by environmental factors. So for instance, if you just shred cabbage and salt it and leave it loosely salted in a bowl, it's not going to turn itself into sauerkraut or anything very pretty. And in that very loose condition where all the surfaces are exposed to oxygen, molds are typically what are going to dominate. And in a warm, humid environment, those molds could literally decompose a head of cabbage into a puddle of slime that bears no resemblance whatsoever to delicious, tangy, crunchy sauerkraut. And it's entirely a matter of environment. To make the sauerkraut, what you got to do is get the veggies nice and juicy and get them submerged under their own juices, or alternatively mix some salt and water together and cover them with a brine. But either way, by getting the vegetables submerged in a salty environment, you are, manipulating the environment and encouraging the growth of certain kinds of organisms, specifically the lactic acid bacteria that can tolerate the saltiness and also doesn't need oxygen. And at the same time, you're discouraging the growth of these molds that are always, spores of them are always there, but they need oxygen in order to thrive. So, all fermentation practices are about, some variation of this, of altering environmental conditions so as to have the effect of encouraging the growth of something while simultaneously discouraging the growth of something else. And I think that, in metaphorical ways, we can think about that also. There are things that we can do that would, discourage people from thinking that we are a safe person for them to talk to about, what they've been going through. And there are other cues that we can give someone that we're actually very interested in hearing that and processing with them, and and mutually sharing aspects of our interior lives.
No, I think that makes sense. And it I think that in my personal reality of it, it's gone on longer, and it has also not, I think that there's a lot of things around the people you're contained with at this moment. It's maybe there's so much indeterminacy, about it. But I think that what's nice about the process of, again, leaning into it with thinking about the metaphor of fermentation is that there's an ongoing quality to its containment. Like, it continues to produce meaningful and that effervescent quality, that kind of like living quality, is able to continue, even if it is in an isolated condition, and so I think that that's what inspired me, was to try and figure out how, I live in a way that is meaningful at this moment, because I think that it's very easy for it to tip over into putrefaction or something like is starting to get in that is not helping us. And I think in this moment, I also go back to the whole idea of which you illustrated so well in fermentation metaphors, this bubbliness. I think we need, as individuals right now, we need that bubbliness more than we've ever needed it right now, and it gets back to that thing, that joy that we have whenever we encounter that effervescent quality. I think that we have to find a way to produce that within this slightly isolated condition that we are in now. And fermentation as metaphor is like the master idea of how one goes about doing that, So, I think that I guess for, for my personal practice of it has been looking at what connections can I still make within the world that I live in. So I live by the sea. I spend a lot of time there. I live near some hills. I spend time there. But I think the piece that you brought to the fore, which is probably more important, is I need to make myself more emotionally available for the other people that I am actually in this container with. I do think that is a piece that's missing, that I, have selfishly tried to create my own sanctuary for myself, but haven't really looked at my embeddedness in that with them, in terms of doing that.
Well, I mean, the one thing I would say is that, I mean, the flip side of this is that, it's important to have boundaries sometimes. So,
Yes.
I mean, it's great to make yourself emotionally available,
Yeah.
but, sometimes for our own preservation, we have to create boundaries around that.
Yes.
Because, any one of us only has, sort of so much to give. We only have the capabilities that we have. And I mean, certainly it's great to try to stretch your capabilities, but
Right.
like one thing we learned over and over again at the sanctuary is that, we're not mental health professionals. Like,
Right.
we can help people with all kinds of things, but we can't help people with everything.
No,
And so,
of course.
I mean, I think it's great to make yourself available, but I think it's also important to acknowledge the flip side of this, that, we can't do that infinitely necessarily. And that, part of self-preservation is also, just having some boundaries about, understanding how much you do have to give.
Yes.
And what you need to hold for yourself, or to share with, someone specific.
Yeah, no, that's an important point, I think. It's more nuanced around it. And the other thing too is around the, again, I'm trying to make it obvious to others something that's happening for me, but I don't quite understand it yet. But it's like with the others that I end up being with, like for me, it's my partner, my mother-in-law, and my cat, and then the land and the space, the place that I'm embedded in, as well as a lot of other factors, obviously come in through all the other things that. But I do see how what the people I'm around are really wanting, I think, is, as you said, there's like a connecting, that is, people are really wanting to still feel connected to one another. And I think about it, maybe symbiotic or symbiosis is not the right way to think about it. But I do think about with, say, for instance, my mother-in-law, she's an avid gardener. Do you know what I mean? And so there's like something that she and I share that we can feel connected around and create that fermenting surface between, so that we can start to have that effervescence in our life, through a shared joy that we have.
Well, and I mean, I would say this is part of the, widespread applicability of fermentation. So, sort of fermentation is, the bubbly phenomenon, and in literal fermentation, that might be, kind of carbohydrates that are being fermented by yeast and bacteria. But, in the English language for hundreds of years, we've referred to sort of anything in a bubbly, agitated state as being fermenting. And so it can be anything. I mean, if your focus is on music, well, there's lots of examples of, times and places where musical styles have fermented, and there's been lots of, kind of new creativity and people bouncing ideas off of each other back and forth. And certainly that can happen in, any kind of, artistic pursuit, but it also can happen in, spiritual and religious pursuits. And it also can happen in gardening. And so, if you have like a gardening partner who's inspiring you, or who's giving you some cuttings of a plant that you can try to, like anytime that you feel like, like you're getting excited just by somebody else's example, and then maybe you can give them something back that excites them, and there can be this sort of like, mutual excitement, or stimulating one another's excitement. But I think that, fermentation is infinitely applicable, like no matter what the what the realm that you're thinking about, whether it's like, emotions, or the garden, or or music, or anything.
Yeah, it's true. And I think that part of it is now is because, like for me in that context, I was gearing up to do like permaculture projects with people in Edinburgh where I was living. And so, yes, there is a way through the miracle of like telecommunication stuff that we can still do that. But she's in my house with me. Do you know what I mean? She's not a permaculture person. She has a more traditional horticulture background, which is, so to me, there's already like a resistance that could be there, as opposed to focusing on the common surface, which is, this is our cabbage that's been shredded together, and we need to just get bubbly with it, as opposed to, fight each other or whatever. I think it's more of like there's something more creative that can come out of it. And I'm just trying to sit with it in my own context and help others sit with it in theirs, to really find that, find the bubbles, because I think they are there,
Well, and also finding the common ground doesn't mean pretending that there's no differences in perspective, but it's like, okay, well, we might be coming at this from very different vantage points, but look how beautiful that flower is. Did you smell that one? It smells so good.
Exactly. And I think that the other thing I wanted to mention, because I know, having observed I've never had the opportunity to observe like your different, I always think of it as a laboratory type environment, or a mad scientist sort of environment, like where you have all of your fermentation projects, but I know at one point there was a basement that I was able to go into, and there was like tons of vessels where there's all these, and I just kind of also using that as a visualization of what we can have in our life right now, is that, you go down there and you've left something to sit for a while, and then you check on it every now and again, right? And part of it is the amount of time. There's a time quality to this that I think is very important. And we're all experiencing a lot of frustration with the way in which we're constricted in place over time. But again, with intentional fermentation, like you said, that actually can become an asset to the development of something that wouldn't have been able to take place unless it was held in place for a long time. Am I right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, different fermented foods and beverages have very different time frames. I mean, you could make yogurt in in 8 hours, but making soy sauce is going to take a year or longer. And there's many kinds of things like cheese. There's very lightly fermented cheeses that could take like a day or two of fermentation, and then Parmesan cheese might take 18 months, or for higher grades of it, you might be 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. So time frames can vary a lot. And some things need daily attention. I have this crock of soy sauce sitting here. It's right in the center of the kitchen because I stir it every day. And it's not that I never forget, but if I forget more than a few days, then then my nose starts to tell me that like, oh, you've been neglecting that soy sauce, because the smell completely changes.
Right. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
time is always part of the story with fermentation, because just to relate it to bubbles, which are really the defining characteristic of fermentation, certainly of metaphorical fermentation, and of literal fermentation, at least in the context of liquids. But bubbles are never forever. Bubbles are, by their nature, fleeting. And every bubble will meet the same fate. It will pop.
Totally. Hopefully on my tongue. And I think that's a good point too, around it as well, is the full body experience. I think that's something and how our senses really need to be alive in all these versions of fermentation. We're really so present with the encounter that we're having, like you're talking about with your soy sauce. You have to give it attention and use like different ways of paying attention to make it really do what you're moving it in. And one last piece I just wanted to make sure we touch on before we come to an end is around something you do bring up and play out in different ways, is one, how fermentation, as you said, is part of the living world. Like, I think that's an important thing, and that involves the smell capacity. It involves like things that have strong flavors, which is I think something that's important. But also you bring up this idea around purity and contamination. And you elaborate on it in different levels. You specifically talk about emergence of COVID, and the idea of slowing the contamination of that we have to COVID, but that ultimately we will all be exposed to it at some point. That's something you bring up, which I thought was really powerful. But similarly, looking at life ways and choices around how, not only literally in the way we approach things like bacteria, viruses, and fungi, but also the idea of what we think is pure in form of our eating choices that we make, and all of that. And I think that I think it's not something we'll be able to really cover in its entirety. But I just wanted to know, what is your how are you sitting with that currently? Like, you wrote that, and it was, now we're in this other phase, a little bit forward around it. And what are your thoughts on it now?
Well, I mean, I would say that they haven't really changed. I mean, I got interested in this because I, over and over again, I've had this experience of, people in my workshops, looking at the jar of shredded cabbage that they salted, and they're looking at this like jar of shredded vegetables, and they're thinking, how can I be sure that I have good bacteria growing in there, and not some dangerous bacteria that might end up making me sick or killing somebody? And, in that context, the way is that there's no case history of it anywhere. Fermenting the process of fermentation makes food safer than it is without fermentation.
Yeah.
Fermented vegetables are much, much, much safer, statistically speaking, than raw vegetables. I mean, actually, there's no case history of food poisoning or illness with fermented vegetables, and there is some limited case history with raw vegetables. So, I mean, fermentation is a strategy for safety, but just as an idea, people project purity in all kinds of ways. Whether it's sort of racialized ideas of purity, cultural notions of purity, people putting their body on a pedestal and having the idea that their body is so pure. And I would say, purity is an aspirational state. Like, it does not exist. Nothing is pure. Everything is, some kind of a mix, some kind of a compound. And I mean, certainly if you're going to talk about, genetically, I mean, the whole benefit of sexual reproduction over non-sexual forms of reproduction is specifically that it creates greater genetic diversity. And that's the benefit of it. So, nothing is genetically pure. We're all, we are all influenced by, lots of different sources of genetics. Nothing is culturally pure. That's just like a fantasy. So, and by the same, and then, then the flip side of that would be contamination. And, contamination is always, we are never free from contamination. We're always exposed to, other people, other organisms, bacteria, viruses, fungi. And, that's just the, that's the biodiverse matrix in which life exists. And it's just the reality. And, that's not to say that, like, okay, there's a dangerous new virus that, is killing a lot of people. And yes, of course, there are things that we can do and that we are doing and have been doing to, slow the transmissibility of it by not seeing a lot of people, not gathering in huge numbers. But all that can do is slow it down. And slowing it down, I mean, I don't mean to diminish the importance of slowing it down at all. Slowing time is like, buying time for more people to be able to be vaccinated and, to build up a herd immunity. But, we live in this biodiverse world of broad exposures, and there's no escaping that, and it's not a desirable thing to escape that.
No. And I think too that at this time, there's so many people, and sometimes you're like literally in the next, they're in the next room with you, that have very different ideas around what it means to try to be safe or pure. Because I think that's how I'm sitting with it sometimes, is this idea of risk management and safety and all of this, which I think we do have to become very much more intelligent about how we manage our own risk, for our given circumstances.
I mean, there's this expression, that people use in the world of, drug addiction and in the world of sex in relation to HIV, which is harm reduction. And it's like, a harm reduction approach. And it's recognizing that, like, okay, well, not everyone is willing to do what it would take to have zero risk. So, what can people do in the context of the things that they feel that are important for them to do that will reduce risk, as much as is practical. And so, like, we're all, well, not all of us, but most of us are in some way in pods with other people. And so we don't have 100% control over the interactions that, that they're having when they're, venturing outside of the pod. And so, just acknowledging that none of us have 100% control, and, acknowledging that people have very different senses of, of harm reduction, of what they're willing to compromise on, what they're not willing to compromise on. But I think that that's what we have to be talking about. And
exactly.
I think that the more that people can be clear about what they're not willing to do, what they are willing to do, it can make the other people who are interacting with them just give them more information so that they can make informed decisions.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I think that is an important thing, to make sure that there's some form of ongoing conversation about that with one another. But I think about it, also how choices that we make, and I think the way that I really sat with it was the piece that you're talking about, the idea of food purity, and the idea that certain foods and certain ways of eating are pure, whereas others are inherently impure. I think about how difficult having those conversations are for people. And then now we're talking about something that we view as similarly related, because some people do feel it with that idea around food purity, is life or death. Like now we're like having this life or death like conversation. You see where people's level of intensity kind of raises up. And I think you've had a lot of experience with that around the conversation around food because of the work that you do, and people have very strong opinions.
Well, let me just clarify, just lest anybody misunderstand. Like,
Please.
I am not arguing for for pure food. I have a little bit of a rant in the book about about people who will say like, oh, I only eat clean food, and just they use the word clean or pure to sort of avoid talking about like what it actually is that they're seeking out in the foods that they eat. And I mean, I absolutely believe that food can be medicine. Food has a lot to do with how we feel day to day. I think most of us could improve the way that we eat in some way, but I try not to make presumptions about what that would be. And for some people, pure food might be all plant source food without any animal source food. And for someone else, it might mean all food that was produced using organic methods and not using any kind of synthesized chemicals. And for some people, that might be like not eating anything that's involves genetically modified organisms, or it might mean not having any fats or oils. I mean, the thing is, people project so many ideas, and I think that we need to use our words to talk about qualitative distinctions in food and what we want to eat and what we don't want to eat. And it has nothing to do with purity or impurity. Nothing is 100% anything. All grains have like little bits of insects and and probably excretions from small mammals. It's the way it is. Nothing is pure, but that doesn't mean that we don't need to make distinctions and think about what kinds of foods we want to be eating.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, I think that at least I'm still sitting with how I sit, because I think that is a conversation I've been a part of many, many, many times, as someone who's fed large groups of people, as someone who fed children, as someone who had lots of parents involved in what their children should and shouldn't eat. And it's massive. Like anytime you run a school lunchroom, you're like immediately embroiled in these conversations. But I sit with it around now. We're having to think about what is safe and how we avoid contamination and what is, I mean? And I think it, because of the level of how we experience it, similarly with food, is life or death. Like it contributes to life or contributes to death. I think that it's one of those things I'm trying to sit with it as well, with this idea of how we ferment together, in our little spaces, in our little places with one another, about how we negotiate our own risk management and all of that. And I think a lot of the things that we brought up before around boundaries, but also openness and emotional availability, there being like this presence thing that is important, as well as finding the other things. I'm thinking about what is the shredded cabbage that you and this person have together, that you can kind of latch onto and create that effervescence, because I do think we also need to have that element needs to be brought to the fore in our life so much now, because there's so much reason to feel adrenalized and terrified that people immediately fall into that. And I think that finding the bubbliness between you and someone else is an antidote to a lot of the fear and sort of the adrenalizing that's going on. Well, do you have anything you want to add? I think you are like the master fermenter that I know. I think that is there anything to end on, that you feel like if someone wanted to explore, it is metaphor that they can apply to their own life outside of reading the book, which I highly recommend, fermentation as metaphor, but what is something that people can do practically or just get on with that you think would help them now to just begin to sit with these ideas outside of listening to us ramble about it?
Well, I mean, I think to just, recognize, like effervescence as a state.
Yes.
And that, sometimes, if you're feeling really in a rut, it can be elusive. Like if you're just not feeling bubbly, you're not feeling bubbly. It's a hard thing to force.
Yeah.
But just, like noticing what makes you excited, what makes the other people around you excited, and what can you do to sort of create more of that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And it folds back into that whole idea of the invisible realm, which I'm always happy when you touch on, like the fact that, the form of the spirit world and all of that has a strong history with fermentation um, as a way of relating to it. And this idea of fermented things, they do create a strong response in us. There's something, our senses definitely wake up whenever we encounter them. So I do think you're right, sitting with effervescence as a state. Well, thanks so much, Sandy, for your time today. And I will have everything linked up, but where's the best place people can find you if they want to touch base with you immediately?
So I have a website, wildfermentation.com, and you can contact me through my website. You can see information about my books. Normally I do a lot of traveling and teaching. These days it's all been online teaching, but I post information about all of that on my website. So my website's really the best place to learn more or to contact me, and that's wildfermentation.com. And JD, it's just been such a pleasure to get to see you and spend a little time with you.
And you. And I do know, you had mentioned about Fermentation Journeys.
Okay, so Fermentation Journeys is the book that I just finished and submitted the other day. And I mean, it's hard for me to say the time frame. I think that they're hoping to get it out this fall. So, I would imagine October, October 2021. But I certainly will be posting information on my website.
Awesome. Thanks so much again, Sandy.
Okay. Thank you, JD.
Bye
Be well.
now.